And now let's see if we can get there. And now let's see if I can get rid of all these videos. Yes. Okay, there we go. So yeah, I've already been introduced, so we're going to dive right into it. It's going to be a bit of a roller coaster because I would need 30 minutes for my research and I have only 10. So there we go. As said in the introduction, my focus is on social movement convergences and shrinking civic spaces. That is a term that is very popular within non-governmental organizations such as ActionAid, for which I've worked. It needs a little introduction in academic spheres, is my experience by now. So civic space is conceptually understood as the political space to organize, to operate, to have a legitimate voice, to protest and to dissent. Per Civicus and Freedom House, civic spaces are shrinking when political rights and civil liberties are progressively dismantled. Space, however, is not a fixed structure, but subject to the influence of civil society actors, including social movements. According to Van der Borg and Therewith, civic space consists of three factors. One, existing institutional channels. Two, discourse and the power to label and frame. And three, the capacity to maintain and create space. The research that I conducted focused on the second and the third components, merged them basically by considering the discursive and material qualities of social movements in their joint attempts to defend, reopen, and recreate civic spaces. My research is located in Nicaragua, which has been engulfed in a nationwide civil uprising since April 2018, the size of which the country had not seen in over 30 years. Significantly, it were Nicaragua's adolescents who had long been absent from other mobilizations that took the initiative to bring everyone to the streets, where it didn't take long for a multi-class alliance to take form. Triggered by both the bushfire of the Indio Maiz Biological Reserve and social security reforms, the days following the April 18th mobilization saw such widespread state-induced bloodshed in the streets that the revolt evolved from these initial demands, ecological and economic, into a call for the resignation of the Ortega-Murillo regime, who have now turned the country into a police state where the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are violently repressed, making it an extreme example of shrinking civic space. And as the table shows, it's derived from the Freedom in the World 2019 report. Freedom House ranked Nicaragua as the largest one-year decline of the civil rights and political liberties, civil liberties and political rights in 2018. At the heart of my research are three autonomous movements. We call them first order movements for reasons that become clear later on. The distinction is relevant. Where the Movimiento Estudiantil was born in the wake of the 2018 uprising and developed situationally during the occupation of university campuses and tranques, the Movimiento Campesino and the Costeños have a much longer standing trajectory of struggle. Now, at the theoretical level, the politics of convergence remain one of the understudied dimensions of social movements. As we understand it, convergence politics are the integrative collaborations, in other words, coalition and alliance building, that result in the creation of convergence spaces. Borrowing from Routledge, these are negotiated spaces of multiplicity and difference, marked by a complexity of interrelations and interactions across all spatial skills. And these spaces are emancipatory, which is an important term to my research, when they contribute to transforming patterns of exclusion and social injustice and to challenging power relationships. Now, in addition to the autonomous movements at the first order level, we also included these convergence spaces in our study with the Coalición Nacional initiated by those second order movements. So it kind of like moves up the hierarchy, currently being the largest effort at the unification of practically all Nicaraguans opposed to the Ortega-Murillo regime. And the collective visions that have been articulated from within these convergence spaces are democracy, freedom, justice, and human rights. Now, when we look back at the theoretical level, more overlooked even than the dynamics of convergence politics are actually their implications. The emancipatory potential of such politics has remained largely unquestioned, thanks to the view that there is strength in numbers, which, however valid, is not an unproblematic assumption. In authoritarian settings, such as Nicaragua, social movements generally converge to form multi-sectoral broker organizations, such as our second and third order movements. However, the first order movements that engage in these convergent spaces are differentially located, both socially and geographically. And the more visible and intense conflicts or struggles, as theory would have it, have the tendency to displace conflicts of perceived lesser importance. Consequently, collective visions, which are the master frames, basically, that are articulated by multi-sectoral broker organizations, are continually at odds with the militant particularisms of first-order movements, meaning their grievances, and in the case of my movements, the generational, classist, and racial ethnic concerns. Now, studies highlighting the bridging potential of universal values, such as those captured by the injustice frame in coalitional cooperation, yet alternative framings can be disregarded by those in positions of privilege, meaning that master frames do not represent a uniform and universally agreed form of these collective visions. And this is where my paper positions that social movement scholarship urgently needs to start integrating theories of intersectionality. Unequally distributed agency resources endow certain group members with more framing power than others. And the outcome, according to Crenshaw, is that the dominance of a particular perspective and set of priorities which perpetuate the marginalization of subgroup grievances, and the dominant perspective then being captured by these collective visions that we just saw. So what we are concerned with then is the invisibilization of autonomous movements within convergent spaces, which would make these spaces exclusionary rather than emancipatory in practice. And emancipatory would mean that these spaces contribute to transforming structural origins of protest rather than perpetuating them. And instead of sharing with you a range of the quantitative findings from our extensive social media content analysis, I would like to share 3 quotes with you that actually show why these theoretical considerations and their practical relevance need to be taken into account, at least when studying the Nicaraguan context. So this is someone who engages in these second and third level convergence spaces. We must all be open to dialogue and to understanding that all interests are legitimate, all of them. But at this moment, there is a supreme interest, which is to end the barbarism of the people that the people of Nicaragua are experiencing. But when we look at people from the Caribbean coast, this is how they look at convergent spaces and at these new kind of like collaborations that we are seeing. Someone points out that when they were experiencing the violent invasion of the colonos and the advance of the agricultural frontier, no one ever even paid attention to them. There was no media attention, no one spoke out on their behalf. And someone else said that an opposition in the country that does not visibilize the struggles, the demands, and the agendas of the coastal people is not a real opposition. What we found through our quantitative social media content analysis is that the grievances of the autonomous first order movements, such as reflected in the previous quotes, were not taken up by the second and the third order movements, who included first order keywords, so pertaining to the autonomous struggles, less than 1% of the time. Meanwhile, the first order movements fully adopted the collective visions that came from these convergent spaces, although to varying degrees. The costeños remain the most concerned with their own subsistence grievances, which they cover nearly 50% of the time in all their posts on Facebook. And that is a stark contrast with the less than 1% coverage by convergent spaces. It therewith appears that the expansion of conflict has not fostered the inclusivity of grievances. Now, the capacity to position demands is tied to representation in convergent spaces. And when we consider the 3 dimensions of civic space, this touches directly upon the power to label and frame. The political development of the Coalición Nacional at the third order saw growing demands from the autonomous first order movements for equitable representation in this space. While the Movimiento Campesino is one of the 7 signatories with an independent seat at the multi-sectoral table, the Movimiento Estudiantil was only offered inclusion as subgroups of each signing party. The students then speak of party hegemony because political parties carry the strongest weight in the Coalición Nacional. And meanwhile, with 6 out of 7 parties originating not with the autonomous regions, the costeños speak of Pacific hegemony. So the reasons underlying movements' discontent over the inclusiveness of convergent spaces raise an important question, namely who determines the convergence. It has been noted within the climate movement that the word convergence too often comes from privileged circles, which rarely question their place in the world and their legitimacy to speak out. Importantly, the social spatial positionalities of groups empower some whilst disempowering others, limiting not only their imaginaries, but also the possibilities of change. And the geographical remoteness of the Caribbean coast and the daily struggle for land rights hinder their capability to converge with urban movements, meaning that the concentration of convergent spaces within Pacific Nicaragua perpetuates the peripheral position of the costeños. This may explain why the indigenous movement, oh, sorry, I lost track of the presentation. This may explain why the indigenous movement is the most vocal about unity, with a coverage of 12.45% compared to less than 3% for all other movements. Historically detached from and disenfranchised by Mestizo Nicaragua, the original peoples of the autonomous regions have come to value the unity of their own communities over national convergences. To enable movements at the margins of privilege and power to actually enjoy the emancipatory potential of convergent spaces, those spaces need to enact a politics of difference, which seeks the recognition and affirmation of differently identifying groups in 2 basic senses: giving political representation to group interests, such as in the Coalición Nacional, and celebrating distinctive cultures and characteristics of different groups. In the Nicaraguan context, we see urban movements focusing on unity and diversity, choosing to ignore difference and subjecting militant particularisms to the unifying tendencies of the collective visions that constitute the stronger systems of antagonism. Simultaneously, the indigenous and afro-descendant peoples have asserted the diversity and unity by highlighting their distinctive positionalities and grievances, stressing, for example, the multiculturality of Nicaragua. When assessing the longevity and emancipatory potential of movements, these tensions need to be addressed urgently, because as Carol found, it was a suppression of difference rather than difference itself that inhibited movements for progressive social change, which is increasingly urgent in countries where civic spaces are so severely restricted, as is the case in Nicaragua. And therefore, my question to the audience would be, how do you think social movements can best navigate these fine lines between unity and diversity within their membership? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aline. A really fascinating talk again, and coming back to these issues of understanding, of people understanding the situations they're in and being able to label their own situations. Mm-hmm.